I definitely want to touch on Taiwan and its, both, in the region and its implications of an attack or a blockade, like we saw, the war games around just very recently. I'd like to discuss that. The thing I want to discuss before that is a big difference between the Soviet Union back in Reagan's time and, China today is the deep interconnectivity into the global economy. I think I believe that this was a very intentional play by the Chinese communists to create this situation where, if you hurt us, everybody suffers, dramatically. So you're going to have to let us continue with our with our project, to dominate by 2049, right? It's a very difficult situation to extricate the US and other Western countries from some of these relationships. And even in cases where there's, profound national security implications, like medical precursors would be a great example. The Trump administration tried to tackle that, I think 4 years ago, probably. Didn't happen, and partially because of intense lobbying against it by pharmaceutical companies. Why? Well, it's an interesting question, right? So maybe if you could get you to comment on that.
Yeah, so some people question, is Cold War really the right term, because they say it's not exactly like the first Cold War because we're more interdependent with China. But we think it is the right term because it is a long-term confrontation between the United States and an autocratic rival for the future of global leadership. So just like World War I is not exactly like World War II, they were both world wars. Similarly, I think these are both Cold Wars, even though they're not exactly the same. And so yes, the interdependence is one difference, but that's starting to change. The United States is putting in place these decoupling policies that started under Trump and are being continued under Biden. And you're right that there are areas where we haven't made progress, but there are other areas where we have made progress, including a bill signed by President Biden just a few weeks ago to ban TikTok. I think there are other evidence of progress as well. And it's also not one-sided. China is decoupling from us, and as you know, they have this dual circulation policy of essentially trying to make themselves invulnerable to the rest of the world, but making the rest of the world dependent on them. And so it's playing out slowly, but I suspect that we will see trade and investment patterns start to follow geopolitical lines like they did during the Cold War, that as American and Western companies move out of China, move into friendly companies, as China pursues this dual circulation strategy, I think the interdependence will lessen and become less of a major challenge than it has been recently.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Matt said. It's a situation in which China puts out documents that are for everybody available to read, where they say in the early 2000s that they want to encourage indigenous innovation. Then they came out with a public document, Made in China 2025, where they say our policy is to build domestic champions who are going to replace foreign companies in China and abroad, dominate the world economy eventually. So that's their policy. Now, we didn't take it seriously enough, but the war in Ukraine was such a shock to the whole international system. And it's becoming also clear that China is supporting Russia in this. So war is no longer something that is inconceivable between the United States and China. I remember I came from Wall Street to serve in the State Department. I remember I was working in policy planning, and I picked up a document from the Congressional Research Service. And I was reading there, and I spilled my coffee all of a sudden. They said, we need to, and this was in 2018, we need to make sure that in case of war, materials that are essential for national security services are not dependent on countries that may be adversaries. It's a simple concept, and the behavior that we see from China, from Russia, from Iran, from North Korea is sobering. So I think the interdependence, you are correct, it exists. I mean, even for military equipment, there is too much dependence on things coming from China. So I think this is an irreversible trend, that the interdependence is going to become less and less. And as Matt said, the Chinese are doing the same thing. They recognize their dependence.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. Like they're decoupling on their own terms, which is not, you know, a lot of people don't know about this concept of comprehensive national power that China employs, where, you know, they rate every country against themselves, and, you know, as long as they're going up or others are going down, things are good. But there isn't. When I first sort of started researching this, I realized they don't believe in win-win.
They do believe in it, and what they mean is China wins twice.
Okay, well, right. It's I mean, you said it's such a simple concept. Why would you manufacture things in China that, you know, have national security implications? It seems kind of crazy, but yet here we are today, right? Where, you know, I've had you know, Tommy Waller on the show talking about these, you know, these giant transformers, right? That are, as far as I know, only manufactured in China now, that are important components of the U.S. grid. You can imagine what happens if the grid goes down.
Well, there is this whole conversation with cranes in ports. The cranes that we use, apparently 70–80% come from China. Well, there is the electronic components, the artificial intelligence components, they're updated. You get updates, and they're coming from Beijing. They're connected. What if they're instructed not to work anymore? Or if we have electronic vehicles, again, what they are all instructed to stop at some point. I mean, these are all. I worked at the State Department. There is a company called NukeTech that manufactures the equipment. When you go through the airport, they check if you have weapons and so on. For a few days in a certain country, they allow people to pass with weapons because some terrorists are. I mean, these are just intolerable things if we want to be prudent.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dan and I don't just admire the problem, though we lay out a strategy for tackling that, and we propose a selective decoupling strategy. And what we say is there are essentially three categories. There are the categories that we've just been discussing, where there are sensitive national security concerns, and there we argue we do need a hard decoupling and stop trade and investment with China altogether, and get our allies to do that as well. Second, there's a category where it's not sensitive national security, but China's cheating, and we need to level the playing field with tariffs and other measures. And then third and finally, we argue there are other areas where it's fine if basically free exchange continues to take place. If China wants to buy American soybeans, if Americans want to buy cheap made-in-China t-shirts, that's fine. It's really the sensitive national security matters where we need to focus.
You know, there's a reason that Huawei is in so many different countries, right? It has the national security priority of becoming the telecom provider, therefore, you know, providing ample opportunity for espionage and also obviously control, right? If and when needed.
Yeah, that's right. And the reason China is dominating is, as you point out, this is part of China's strategy, and they realize the United States gains enormous intelligence benefit from the fact that we controlled the kind of communications infrastructure of the 20th century, and so they want to control the communications infrastructure of the 21st century. Fortunately, the United States and its allies have, for the most part, done a good job of banning Huawei, especially when it comes to 5G and other systems. But China is making a lot of inroads in the global south, in large part because it's so affordable. But this does pose a potential problem. If China controls the digital infrastructure of the 21st century in Latin America, Africa, what does that mean for their geopolitical alignment? What does that mean for the future of democracy in those countries? And so we do talk in the book about ways that the United States can provide alternatives, the United States and its allies, because you go to these countries and you point out the national security concerns and the intelligence concerns, and often they say, okay, we get it, but what's the alternative? It's cheap. We're developing countries, and so we talk about some strategies in the book for the United States and its allies to incentivize the private sector to provide alternatives to Huawei and these other unfair, cheap, subsidized technologies that China is flooding, using to flood the global market.
Now, we win, they lose is actually the Chinese Communist Party strategy as well, isn't it?
Yeah, we are in a serious conflict contest. We don't like the term competition. And by the way, disclaimer, general disclaimer, Matt and I both work at the Atlantic Council, a non-partisan institution, but we wrote a partisan book.
You know, actually, let me jump in on that a little bit, because you know, the Atlantic Council has been around forever, right? And one of the things, you know, in our discussions I've learned is that unlike, let's say, Heritage, which has this kind of one voice approach, right? Atlantic Council isn't like that. So you have to provide your disclaimer. You might have, you know, Atlantic Council fellows or directors that have diametrically opposed positions to yours. Is that right?
I wouldn't expect that. I would expect them to all be for freedom. It's an American institution, and I don't expect any diametrical points of view, but some of our colleagues may be coming out in favor of policies that are supported by the Democratic Party more. But what we point out is that what is sort of the quick formulation of the Biden administration's approach to relations with China is a mixture, they say, and both President Biden and Secretary Blinken, a mixture of cooperation, competition, and confrontation. And what Matt and I say, they got it 1/3 right about the confrontation part. There is really not much cooperation, because on the things that the argument that we hear from the Biden administration is we have to cooperate with them on transnational things that are essential for humanity, like climate change and health. Well, on climate change, they're the greatest polluters. They're still building coal plants when we are not. Our CO2 emissions are going down, theirs are going up. And on health, there was no cooperation in finding the origins of COVID. And when the Australians proposed that, they started a trade war. They retaliated against Australian export for years, and it cost them billions for that. So we don't find much cooperation. And in terms of competition, it's not a fair competition. It's not like track where we are each on our lane, or a tennis game with a referee and we stay on. There is lying, stealing, and cheating going on. It's a serious contest that we have with diametrically different views of what the world will look like and how countries relate to each other.
Maybe I'll just add a point on the Atlantic Council. So it is a nonpartisan institution. So the mission statement is shaping the global future together. So I think that's something that every employee agrees on. But otherwise, individual scholars, centers, program directors have their own views. And so there are a lot of different opinions on different policy issues at the Council. So I suspect there are some colleagues at the Atlantic Council who would disagree with some of the arguments in our book, but that's okay. We're a big organization. A lot of big organizations have people who disagree with each other on certain issues.
I want to come back to this idea of, I guess ultimately it's American exceptionalism. I really do feel like a lot of Americans today are kind of demoralized. Whether, frankly, left and right, I think this is a bipartisan issue, actually. And don't believe America is this force for good in the world anymore. Or maybe a good way to go would be to decline, or to, recede a little bit, right? Too much adventurism, too much of this, you know, sort of nation building, this kind of stuff. We really got to step away from those foreign wars. I mean, there's, you know, you look at what happened in Afghanistan after all that effort, all that, you know, so-called blood and treasure, right? And the Taliban's in charge, right? I mean, these are very real questions, and it is a new time, right? So the global order, as it's discussed, is a very different one.
So, in our book, Matt and I present three. It's a book on foreign affairs, and we make the argument that the Republican Party is not so divided as many believe that it is, between the Reagan and the Trump wings, and that the three things on which there is consensus, clear consensus, firm consensus, is peace through strength, moving from free trade, or recognizing that we need fair trade and not dream about free trade, and American exceptionalism. So an interesting question would be, what does American exceptionalism, what's the place of American exceptionalism in a foreign policy book? And it has a crucially important place, and your question touches on that, which is peace through strength addresses the critically important element of military strength to preserve, to safeguard the national security of the United States. The fair trade part deals with the economic strength. Economic security is national security. American exceptionalism is the strength of ideas that inspire people. And if we don't believe at home in American exceptionalism, we are not as strong as we could be in facing our external adversaries. How can we ask our young men and women in uniform to put their life at risk to defend America if America is described as racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, and on and on and on and on? All the blame America first themes. In the book we talk about the difference between progressive and conservative views of the world in general. And the progressives tend to dwell on the faults of America to the detriment of having a balanced view and recognizing that the qualities of America and the positive contribution of America and of American principles for the freedom and prosperity of the American people of the world far exceed the faults. So this is why we have American exceptionalism as one of the three key principles on which we are building everything else. And it needs to start with recognizing it at home and promoting it at home.
I agree, and I'd add, we do see, well, in the data, we cite data, 69% of Republicans agree with the statement that the United States is the greatest country in the world. Only like 30% of Democrats agree with that. So empirically, we see that conservatives are stronger supporters of American exceptionalism than progressives. And then you mentioned Afghanistan. Wouldn't it be better if we just came home? And I think the answer is no. And I think the people who focus on Iraq and Afghanistan are other mistakes, and there have been mistakes in U.S. foreign policy, focus on the mistakes but miss the bigger picture that I talked about before, about how the United States has shaped a world that's safer, richer, and freer for the American people over the past several decades. And would we be better if we came home? We tried that. That was Obama's policy. He thought the United States was overextended because of Iraq and Afghanistan. We're going to play a smaller role in the world. He thought this would encourage other countries to step up. Instead, what we saw is that evil adversaries filled the vacuum. Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time because Putin knew he could get away with it. China started taking territory from our allies in the South China Sea with their island building campaign because they knew they could get away with it. Obama pulled troops out of the Middle East. ISIS rose up and started beheading Americans. And so I think we see that when the United States withdraws, again, goodness doesn't fill the vacuum, evil does, and so that's why we need an engaged United States in the world to secure the interest of the American people.
And that's different than this so-called nation building approach.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think Trump really illustrated this with his peace through strength approach. So Iran kills an American, Trump hits back hard and kills Soleimani, a top Iranian general. But he didn't invade the country, send in 100,000 troops, stay for 20 years, and say he's going to turn it into a democracy. So I think that's the difference of being strong, hitting back when your adversaries challenge you, but not get caught into these kind of nation-building campaigns and using military force for things that military force isn't really a good tool to address.
As we finish up, maybe I'll just ask each of you to give me a kind of a concluding thought here. I'll recommend reading the book because I do think you both synthesized a whole bunch of thought. You know, I'm greatly appreciative of that. Anyway, final thought, Dan?
Well, since you mentioned that I come from Romania and I have both a perspective as an American, but also a view of where we are and where we are going, also from a perspective. I have absolutely no doubt that the United States and led by the United States, the free world will prevail in this new Cold War. Just like we prevailed against tyranny in the First World War, in the Second World War, and in the First Cold War, because all autocracies are inefficient, and the ones we are facing today are just as inefficient and in some ways even more inefficient, and as brittle as past ones and maybe more brittle. So in terms of the we win, they lose, I'm very, very optimistic that we'll win. It will require effort, a strong sense of purpose and courage, but we will prevail.
You know, I think there were other times in U.S. history where we were also pessimistic. You know, there were periods during the Cold War, the 1970s, the Jimmy Carter malaise, where many people thought the Soviet Union was going to overtake the United States. And the best we could do was to have détente with the Soviet Union to lock it in with a series of arms control agreements. There were periods in the 1980s where people thought, no, it's Japan. Japan is going to overtake the United States. Reagan didn't buy either of those. He took on Japan and trade negotiations, took on the Soviet Union and prevailed. And so I think just like in that period, this is maybe a time for some pessimism. I understand why people feel that. We are in a very dangerous environment. China is the greatest adversary we've ever faced. But I think just like Reagan looked at that situation and said, no, we can do this, I think this is a time to look at the situation and say, yes, it's challenging, but we can do this. And in our book, we try to lay out a blueprint for how we can do that. So I'd encourage your readers to get the book. It's available on Amazon, and let's go out together and win the new Cold War.
Well, Matt Kroenig, Dan Negrea, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all for joining Matt Kroenig, Dan Negrea, and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Yanya Kellick.